A plate shattered against the tile floor. Then another. A man's voice cut through the clatter, sharp and mean, calling a woman stupid, worthless, slow. She backed into the corner by the walk-in freezer, hands shaking, fighting not to cry where the customers could see her. He leaned in close and told her she was lucky to have a job at all. Then he walked out like nothing had happened. She slid down the wall and let the tears come, sure that no one in the room had noticed. But someone had. A big man in the far booth had watched it all over the rim of his coffee cup, and he had not moved a muscle. His name was Wade Cole, and folks around Barstow called him Preacher. What did a quiet man in a corner booth do that made a grown bully beg? Stay with me on this one. Let me tell you about the Copperline Bar and Grill. It sat alone off the old highway, a low brick building with a gravel lot and a neon sign that only lit half the letters. Truckers stopped there. Ranch hands. Folks passing through who didn't want to drive another 40 miles for a burger. The food was good, and everybody knew why. The food was good because of Dana Whitfield. Dana ran that kitchen like it was the only thing she had, and honestly, it just about was. She was 34. She had a boy at home, 7 years old, named Cole, and she was raising him by herself after his daddy took off 2 winters back. She got up at 5. She dropped Cole at her mother's, drove the truck that barely started, and stood over a hot flat top for 10 hours a day. She never called in sick. She never once let a plate go out cold. Ask anybody who ate there. They'd tell you the woman could make a chicken fried steak taste like Sunday. Now here's a thing about that kitchen. It was hers in every way that mattered and hers in no way at all. She knew where every pan hung. She knew which burner ran hot and which one lied to you. She taught herself to plate pretty on chipped dishes and to stretch a slow week's order so nothing went in the trash. She took a broken-down roadside grill and made it somewhere people talked about. But her name wasn't on a single piece of paper, and that was the whole trouble, because a woman can build something with her own 2 hands and still not own 1 nail of it. Here's the other thing you need to know. Dana wasn't weak. Don't get that idea. She was tired and she was scared, but those aren't the same as weak. She was scared because she was 1 paycheck away from losing everything, and the man who signed those paychecks knew it. That man was Roy Setzer. Roy owned the Copperline. He'd inherited it from his uncle and run it into the kind of place it was through no skill of his own. He wore a gold watch that was too big for him, and a belt buckle he polished more than he worked. Roy liked to stand at the end of the bar with a beer he never paid for and tell everybody how much he did around the place. Truth was, Roy did almost nothing. He counted the register. He signed the checks. And he made Dana's life a quiet, grinding misery every single day. It started small, the way these things do. A comment about her being slow when she wasn't. A joke at her expense in front of a full room. He'd send a plate back that was cooked exactly right, just to watch her make it twice. He'd stand behind her while she worked and sigh, loud, like her whole existence was a burden he was too kind to mention. Then it got worse. Roy started skimming. He'd take the credit card tips at the end of the night, count them behind the office door, and hand Dana back a fraction of what folks had left her. She knew it. She could feel it in her bones, the way you know when someone's lying to your face. But she couldn't prove it, and she couldn't afford to lose the job trying. So she took it. Night after night. She'd drive home doing the math in her head. What the room had been, how many tables, what a normal Friday should have brought, and every time the number in her pocket came up short. She started keeping a little notebook on the nightstand. Not because she had a plan, just because writing it down was the only way she had of saying, out loud to nobody, this happened, and it was real, and I'm not crazy. And Roy, feeling bold because nobody ever pushed back, got meaner. Now, most days the far booth by the window sat empty, or it sat occupied by the same man. He came in 3, 4 times a week. He ordered black coffee and the meatloaf, and he tipped like the meal cost triple. He didn't talk much. He was big, not Jim big, not for show, but the kind of big that came from a hard life lived outdoors. Gray in his beard. Forearms like fence posts. He wore a worn leather vest with patches you'd have to look close to read, and most folks didn't look close, because something about the man told you not to stare. Parked outside, right by the door, sat a motorcycle with a sidecar. And in that sidecar, most days, sat the oldest, saddest-looking bloodhound you ever saw. Long ears that dragged near the ground. Eyes like he'd seen the whole world and forgiven it anyway. His name was Biscuit, and he went everywhere his owner went. When it was cold, Biscuit came inside and lay under the far booth, and nobody complained, because nobody was going to be the one to complain. The man in the booth was Wade Cole. Preacher. And what the town didn't say out loud, but everybody somehow knew, was this. Preacher was the road boss of the Iron Vultures, the club that had kept that stretch of desert quiet and honest for 20 years. He didn't advertise it. He didn't need to. He just watched. 6 years he'd sat in that same booth, and in 6 years he'd learned that place better than the man who owned it. He knew which trucker was going through a divorce and tipped anyway. He knew Dana counted her drawer twice because she'd been burned before. He watched the way a man watches a river, patient, in no hurry, letting it tell him what it was going to do. And on the afternoon our story turns, he watched Roy Setzer break Dana Whitfield down over a burger sent back for being cooked exactly the way it was ordered. The burger came back to the window on a rush ticket. Well done, the customer had said, and well done is what Dana made. But the customer changed his mind halfway through and told Roy it was dry, and Roy, who never missed a chance to look important, came storming into the kitchen swinging. He didn't just correct her. He unloaded. He called her names I won't repeat. He told her she was the reason business was slow, which was a lie so big it should have cracked the floor. He knocked a stack of clean plates off the counter just to hear them break, just to watch her flinch. And then he leaned in, close enough that she could smell the beer, and he said the thing that landed hardest. He said, "You think anybody else would hire a woman like you? You've got nowhere to go, Dana. Remember that." Then he walked out to the bar and poured himself another beer like a man who'd just done an honest day's work. Dana held it together until the door swung shut. That was the thing about her. She never cried where they could see. She waited until she was alone by the freezer, and then she sank down and let it out, quiet as she could, one hand pressed over her mouth. She was sure nobody knew. She was sure she was invisible in there, One more worn-down woman in one more roadside kitchen, crying where the exhaust fan would swallow the sound. She didn't hear the swinging door. She didn't hear the boots. What she heard was the soft, deliberate click of the deadbolt sliding home. Dana's head came up fast. Preacher stood just inside the kitchen door, and he had turned the lock behind him. For a half-second her heart slammed, because a locked door with a big man in it is a nightmare shape, and she'd learned the hard way what men could be. But he didn't come closer. He stayed right there by the door, hands loose at his sides, and he looked at her the way you'd look at something you were trying not to spook. He said one thing. He said it low and even, no heat in it at all. "Who hurt you?" Dana wiped her face fast and got to her feet and started saying she was fine. It was nothing, just a long day, the way you do. She reached for a towel to look busy. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She said it again. "I'm fine, really," and her voice broke right down the middle on the word fine, and that was answer enough for a man who'd spent his whole life reading people. He didn't push. That's the part folks always get wrong about men like Preacher. They think it's about pushing. It's not. He just crouched down slow, with a small grunt because his knees were shot, and he opened the kitchen door a crack. And Biscuit came in. The old hound padded across the tile, nails clicking, ears swinging, and he went straight to Dana like he'd known her his whole life. He didn't jump up. He didn't bark. He just walked up to where she'd sunk back down against the wall, turned around twice, and laid his heavy head right in her lap. Then he let out a long, low sigh, the kind only an old dog can make, and closed his eyes. Something in Dana broke open. Not the bad kind of breaking. The other kind. She put both hands in that dog's loose, warm fur, and she bent over him, and she cried like she hadn't cried in 2 years, and Preacher just stayed by the door and let her. He didn't say they're there. He didn't tell her it was okay. He knew it wasn't okay. He just gave her the room to fall apart where it was safe too. And then, with her fingers buried in Biscuit's ears, it came out. All of it. The skimmed tips. The names. The threats about Cole, about having nowhere to go. Months of it spilling out onto that kitchen floor. She told him about the notebook on the nightstand, how she'd written down every short night not knowing why, only knowing she couldn't let it disappear. She told him she'd almost quit a dozen times and couldn't, because there was a 7-year-old who needed shoes and a mother who needed the help, and no room anywhere in her life for pride. Preacher listened to every word without moving. When she finally ran out and looked up, embarrassed, wiping her face expecting pity or a lecture, she got neither. He just nodded once slow and said, "Okay." Then he stood and he unlocked the door and he said, "Wash your face and finish your shift. Nobody's going to bother you today." And he walked back out to his booth and sat down and picked up his coffee like nothing at all had happened. For a little while, it seemed like maybe that was the whole of it. Roy stayed out front. Dana finished the dinner rush. Preacher paid his check, left his usual 2-big tip, and folded a napkin under the salt shaker. The bar settled into its evening hum. Dana wiped down the flat top and let herself breathe, a real breath, the first one all day. She even smiled a little when Biscuit thumped his tail at her from the booth. The storm had passed. That's what she let herself believe. It was over. It was not over. The bell over the front door jingled, and Roy came back in from the parking lot where he'd been on the phone. But he wasn't alone, and he wasn't done. He had a man with him in a tan uniform shirt, and he had a hard, satisfied look on his face, and he was already talking loud enough for the whole room to hear. "That's her," Roy said, pointing across the bar at Dana. "That's the one. Deputy, I want to press charges. She's been stealing from my register for months." The room went still. A fork stopped halfway to somebody's mouth. Dana felt the floor drop out from under her. Because this wasn't the old fight anymore. This wasn't Roy being cruel, where only she could hear. Roy had brought the law. Roy had said the word charges. And here is the thing about a woman with a 7-year-old boy and a truck that barely starts and no cushion under her at all. An accusation like that doesn't just cost her the job. It costs her everything. A theft charge means no other kitchen hires her. It means questions about whether she's fit to keep coal. It means a court date she can't take off work for, a lawyer she can't pay, a word next to her name that follows her into every job she'll ever apply for. Roy hadn't just doubled down. He'd changed the whole nature of the war. He'd turned a private humiliation into a public destruction, and he'd brought the government to do his hitting for him. Roy was smiling now. He'd figured it out, see. He'd figured that if Dana ever did try to tell somebody about the tips, all he had to do was get his story in first. Accuse her. Make her the thief before she could make him one. And who's a deputy going to believe? The man who owns the bar and plays cards with the sheriff, or the broke-line cook with a sob story? He'd probably been rehearsing it for weeks, waiting for the day she finally cracked, so he'd have his excuse ready-made. That's the ugly part. He hadn't lost his temper. He'd planned this. It was smart. It was cruel. And it almost worked. Let me stop right here for 1 second. If you've ever watched somebody get kicked while they're already down and felt that heat rise up in your chest, if you're the kind of person who believes the quiet ones deserve somebody in their corner, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. This is the kind of story we tell here, and it's about to turn. Okay. Back to it. The deputy pulled out a notebook. He looked tired, and he looked like he wanted this to be simple. He asked Dana to step out from behind the counter. Dana couldn't move. Her mouth had gone dry. She looked around the room for one friendly face and found a dozen people looking at their plates, because that's what folks do. They look away. They don't want the trouble. All but one. The chair in the far booth slid back. Slow. It scraped once across the floor, and in that quiet room it was loud as a gunshot. Preacher stood up to his full height, and he set his coffee cup down gentle, and he said, in that same low, even voice he'd used in the kitchen, "Hold on now, Roy. Before that man writes anything down, let's do this right." Roy turned, and the smile flickered on his face when he saw who it was. Just for a second. But it flickered. Because Roy, for all his loudness, was not a completely stupid man, and some animal part of him knew that of all the people in that bar, the one in the leather vest was the one you did not want turning to look at you. Preacher walked over unhurried. Biscuit lifted his head and watched. Preacher stopped a comfortable distance from the deputy, never crowding him, Always respectful, because that's how you talk to a man with a badge if you're smart. And he said, "Deputy, my name's Wade Cole. Some folks call me Preacher. I've been sitting in that booth 4 days a week for 6 years. I saw the whole thing today, and I've seen a lot of things before today. Before you take one man's word, would you let me show you something?" The deputy looked at him a long moment. And here's where it gets good, so pay attention. The deputy's face changed. Not to fear exactly. To recognition. He said, "Quiet, you're Cole." And Preacher said, "I am." And the deputy closed his notebook halfway and said, "All right. Show me." Roy started to sputter. He said, "Now wait a minute, you can't just, this is my bar, this is my." And Preacher turned and looked at him. Just looked at him, and Roy stopped talking. It was the strangest thing to watch, folks would say later. A grown man cut off cold not by a shout, not by a fist, but by a pair of steady eyes that had clearly seen worse men than Roy Setzer, and hadn't been impressed by them either. Preacher said, "Roy, go get the tip ledger. The green book you keep in the office drawer. Go on." The color drained right out of Roy's face. See, here's what Roy hadn't understood all those months. He thought the quiet biker in the corner was just a quiet biker in the corner. He thought Preacher was some old road dog nursing coffee, because he had nowhere better to be. But the copper line sat on land, and that land had a story, and the story was this. When Roy's uncle got sick, and the bar nearly went under 8 years back, it wasn't the bank that carried the note through the hard year. The bank had already said no. The bank had the papers half drawn up to take the place and sell the land out from under it. It was a quiet man who believed a roadside bar was worth keeping alive for the folks who worked it. A quiet man who wrote a check that Friday and asked for nothing back but the paper. Preacher held the note on that building. He'd never once thrown it in anybody's face. He'd never once acted like he owned a thing. He just ate his meatloaf and watched and waited to see what kind of man Roy Setzer would turn out to be. Now he knew. Roy didn't move, so Preacher walked back to the office himself, slow, and Roy scrambled after him yelling about privacy. And Biscuit heaved up off the floor and followed, and half the bar drifted after them because nobody was about to miss this. Preacher opened the drawer. He didn't break it. He didn't force it. He knew right where it was, because a careful man notices where another man hides things. He took out the green ledger, and he took out the register tape from the last 2 weeks, and he laid them both on the bar side by side where the deputy could see. And then, calm as a Sunday preacher reading scripture, which is exactly where the name came from, he walked the deputy through it. Line by line. Here's what the customers charged in tips on their cards, right here on the card machine's own record. Machine doesn't lie, deputy. Machine's got no reason to. And here's what Roy wrote down in his little green book as paid out to the kitchen. And look at the gap. Night after night after night. $40 here. 60 there. 100 on a Friday. Money that folks in this county left for the woman who cooked their supper. Money that never once made it into her hands. He didn't rush a word of it. He let each night's number sit in the air before he moved to the next, and with every line the room got quieter, and Roy got smaller, until the whole thing stood there plain as a fence in daylight, and there wasn't a soul in that bar who could pretend not to see it. The deputy looked at the two columns for a long time. Then he looked at Roy, and his whole face had gone cold and flat, the way a decent man's face goes when he realizes he was about to arrest the wrong person entirely. He said, "Roy, how long has this been going on?" Roy started to lie. Of course he did. He said the machine was wrong. The numbers didn't mean anything. Dana must have. And Preacher said, "Quiet, don't. Just don't, Roy. Everybody in this room already knows. The only thing you get to decide now is whether you make it worse." The whole bar was watching. Truckers, ranch hands, the couple whose burger started the whole thing, staring at their own plates in shame. And Dana stood by the kitchen door with her hand over her mouth, and this time she wasn't hiding the tears, because these were a different kind, and she'd earned the right to cry them where everybody could see. Now, you might be expecting the part where Preacher grabs Roy by the collar, where the club comes through the door, where somebody gets hurt. That's not what happened. That's not what men like Preacher are, no matter what the patches make you think. What happened was worse for Roy than any punch, because a punch heals and a punch you can be angry about. What Preacher did left Roy nothing to be angry about at all. Preacher took a pen off the bar and slid a napkin over to Roy, and he said, "Here's how this goes. You're going to figure the total. Every dollar you took out of that woman's pocket, all the way back. She kept her own count, didn't you, Dana?" Dana nodded, because she had, in a little notebook at home, she'd written down every short night for months not knowing what she'd ever do with it, and Preacher said, "Good. You two are going to sit down with the deputy as your witness, and you're going to add it up honest. And then you're going to pay her back. Every cent. Tonight, whatever's in the register, and the rest on a schedule the deputy holds you to." Roy said, "And if I don't?" Preacher looked at him. And he said the only hard thing he said that whole day, and he said it soft as anything. "Then I call the note, Roy. I've held the paper on this building for 8 years. You've never once had to think about it, because I never once made you. But it's mine to call, and if you fight this woman one more inch, I'll call it, and I'll hand the deed to her, and you can go find out what it's like to have nowhere to go. You taught her that phrase. Let's not make me teach it back to you." The bar was so quiet you could hear Biscuit's tail thump once against the floor. Roy Setzer sat down on a stool like his legs had quit. And he added up the money. All of it. It came to a little over $4,000, months of 40 here and 60 there. And hearing the number out loud in front of the whole room did something to the people in that bar. You could feel it move through them. The couple with the burger got up and left cash on their table, way too much, and wouldn't meet anybody's eye. A trucker put a 20 in Dana's tip jar and squeezed her shoulder on his way out. The deputy took down every detail in his notebook, the real details this time. He told Roy that skimming wages was its own kind of crime, and that whether it went further than tonight would depend on how square Roy made it and how fast. Then he tipped his hat to Dana, said, "Ma'am, sorry for the fright," and told her she hadn't done a single thing wrong. He shook Preacher's hand at the door, man to man, and he drove off into the dark. Roy emptied the register into Dana's hands that night. $600 and some, the most she'd held at once in 2 years. He couldn't look at her while he did it. His gold watch caught the light, and he pulled his sleeve down over it like he was ashamed of it for the first time in his life. Dana Whitfield kept her job. But it wasn't the same job, and it wasn't the same Dana. Word of what happened at the copper line went up and down that highway faster than any sign could carry it. Business didn't slow down like Roy always claimed. Dana was making it. Business picked up. Folks drove the extra 40 miles now, on purpose, to eat at the place where the quiet biker made it right. And every one of them knew who's cooking to thank. Roy paid back every dollar. He didn't have much choice, and somewhere in the paying, something in him shifted. I won't tell you he turned into a saint. Men like Roy rarely do. But he stopped standing at the end of the bar with his free beer. He started showing up early to help unload the trucks. He learned the names of the folks who worked for him, and he said them like they mattered. It's a strange thing, watching a small man get made humble. It doesn't fix everything, but it's better than the alternative, and the whole town watched it happen. As for Preacher, he came in 3-4 days a week, same as always. Black coffee, the meatloaf, booth by the window, biscuit under the table when it was cold, sidecar when it was warm. He never once brought up what he'd done. If you tried to thank him for it, he'd just wave you off and change the subject to the weather or the ball game. That was his way. He didn't do it to be thanked. He did it because he'd sat in that corner long enough to learn who deserved somebody in theirs, and because a man who has the power to make a town honest has no business spending it on himself. Here's the picture I want to leave you with. A few months on a slow gray Tuesday, Preacher came in and settled into his booth. Dana came out from the kitchen wiping her hands on her apron, and she wasn't hiding anymore, and she wasn't shaking. She had a little more color in her face and a lot more steel in her spine. She set his coffee down without him asking. And she'd brought something for Biscuit, a fresh biscuit, still warm, made special, because of course she had. The old hound took it gentle from her hand and thumped his tail, and Dana laughed, a real laugh, the kind that fills a kitchen. And Preacher, the quiet man in the corner, looked up at her over the rim of his cup, and the corner of his mouth moved just a little, which for him was the same as a whole standing ovation. Remember how this started. A plate breaking on a kitchen floor. A woman crying where she thought nobody could see. That's where we came in. Now here's where it ends. Same kitchen. Same woman. Only now the plates don't break, and the door doesn't need a lock, and when she cries, it's the good kind, and there's always an old dog and a quiet man close by to make sure of it. Some people spend their whole lives being loud and end up meaning nothing. And every so often you meet a man who never raises his voice at all, and somehow the whole world straightens up around him. Preacher never threw a punch that day. He never even raised his voice. He just turned a lock, let an old dog do the talking, and reminded one cruel man that the quietest person in the room is very often the one holding all the cards.